This would be a very good time for you to shut up.
Don't you know me? Don't you know that that's an impossibility, that could never happen?
It is our time to do all we can do, and it's an urgent time.
Don't you know that?
And now, Burnie Thompson, where the golden age of radio lives on.
Oh, yeah, I am excited about this one. We've got with us today Sheriff Richard Mack, and I'm so excited about this. I've had Sheriff Richard Mack on many times before, but I got to tell you about him real quick. He is the sheriff who, in 1997, defeated the Clinton administration in the Supreme Court. The Clinton administration and Janet Reno said, you have got to enforce the Brady bill. And Sheriff Richard Mack said, no, we don't, and we won't. This is a Second Amendment county here, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled. They didn't rule. I take it back. The Supreme Court opined correctly that the federal government cannot use and commandeer state resources or county resources to enact federal laws. They reaffirmed that principle known as the anti-commandeering doctrine, and we have with us right now the founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, the CSPOA. We have Sheriff Richard Mack. How'd I do there, Sheriff? Did I get it all right?
Yeah, pretty good, Bernie. Thanks a lot.
Great to have you. I thought of you right away, Sheriff Mack, when I was hearing Chris Ann Hall explain that the Obama administration and the Attorney General and some cities like New York and Minneapolis, they have signed on with the UN to have a global militarized police force to combat extremism in American cities. Have you heard about this?
Yes, I have, and boy, I think they should get to Chicago real quick and stop all that gun control going on there that's doing so well.
It's quite remarkable how the president will just outright lie and say that cities with more gun control have less violence. That's not true, is it, Sheriff?
No, it hasn't been since the beginning of time, actually. It's astonishing. He also wants to compare us to Great Britain and Australia. There's one big difference, and there's two things to bring up on every one of those arguments. When I was in my first stage of my lawsuit, it actually began in '94, and as you pointed out correctly, we won in 1997 at the United States Supreme Court, the only time in American history where a handful of sheriffs sued the federal government and actually won a landmark decision at the U.S. Supreme Court. It's an astonishing case. But regardless, at the first level at the district court was a man by the name of Judge John M. Roll. He was killed about 4 years ago at the Gabby Gifford shooting in Tucson, Arizona. He was actually there just coming out of Safeway. And it's still unclear as to why he was really there. But regardless, he was the most powerful of any of the justices to hear this case. He gave us the Fifth Amendment and the 10th Amendment, saying that the law was constitutionally vague and violated my rights under the Fifth Amendment as well as the 10th on states' rights and state sovereignty. And he said in his courtroom, when the federal government tried to throw out all these statistics to prove that gun control helped our country and made it safer, he pointed his finger at the federal attorney and said, do not try to pretend in my courtroom that some statistical analysis might equate to constitutionality. And see, and that's what everybody in the country needs to know and understand. Statistics pointing at either the benefits or the drudgeries of any law do not make it constitutional.
And he pointed to the Fifth Amendment. That's I would expect that he would point to the 10th.
Yeah, we filed on the Fifth. We filed on the 13th, 5th, and 10th.
Tell me, Sheriff Mack, why the Fifth Amendment? That's the Due Process Amendment, I believe.
Correct. It violated my rights to due process because they threatened to arrest us if we failed to comply.
Oh.
And he said that violated due process, and it was constitutionally vague under the Fifth Amendment because of that.
And was this the case that Justice Anthony Scalia said?
Yes.
Basically, he said that the federal government cannot commandeer state or county resources to enforce federal acts.
Correct, and it went much further and broader than that. But yes, that's Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia was the what do you call it? Well, anyway, he ruled. He ruled for the majority. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And so he wrote the opinion, and it's very powerful. But it basically says in the whole decision that not only cannot the federal government, Congress, President, whoever, commandeer local sheriffs and their offices for federal bidding, it said in no uncertain terms that the federal government can't command any local official to do anything, and that we are not subject to federal direction. States are not subject to federal direction, and that's absolutely earth-shattering. That's so revolutionary in and of itself, and it's no wonder that the federal government and even some state governments try to hide from this decision, because they want to keep the financial relationship with Washington, D.C., and they don't want to upset the apple cart.
Yep, that's it. That's it. States have become like teenagers, haven't they? They want their autonomy, and they want to be able to go out and do their own thing, but they also want daddy's money. And that's
the money coming, and everything's fine.
Yeah, and this is something I want to encourage everybody to just take a moment and search it online and read about it. It's the anti-commandeering doctrine. The federal government cannot force states to enforce federal acts, not only anti-constitutional ones, but any federal act. They can't force states to do it.
That's right, and it's really so mind-blowing that this decision went so broad and deep, and that now states are saying, well, we don't want all these incursions from the federal government, and then they sue them. So we already sued them. We already settled this issue.
Yeah.
Go read the case. And I don't know what's up with one of the worst ones on that was Governor Abbott in Texas. He would sue every other day against Obama administration, and it was on the exact same issue that we sheriffs had already won this case on. And not only that, one of the sheriffs was from Texas.
Wow. It's interesting too, Sheriff Mack, because what I find now, I find a lot of hallmarks in what I call Omerica, because I believe that the fundamental transformation is nearly complete. Certainly I see remnants of America, but I believe we now live in Omerica. And one of the hallmarks of Omerica is a hyper-compliance society and a hyper-litigation society, where everything is thrown back into court and clogged up, and there's mass chaos, disruption, and confusion. And it all goes back to, the governing philosophy of, you can get more done when there's a crisis. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. Do you find that to be true as well?
Well, coincidentally, that's actually something that Scalia mentions in the decision.
Wow.
He does. He actually says the crisis of the day. In other words, that Congress wants to, or the federal government always makes attempts to concentrate power in one location as an expedient solution to the crisis of the day. End quote.
And that's what the founders feared most, was a central power. They wanted to disperse it.
Yes. So that's so astonishing that people can't see that. But the other part of the gun equation is, first, statistical analysis, as I said, doesn't make anything constitutional. So you can do that till the cows come home about the statistical analysis. But quite frankly, you can boil the statistical analysis down to this: you're either safer with a gun or you're an easy target without one. That's it.
Yeah.
Period. And isn't it funny or ironic? I don't like to use the word funny on any of this because it's not funny. Isn't it ironic that every time we have some sort of shooting, whether it's just a neighborhood dispute or it's a mass shooting, the first thing people want is somebody with a gun there. They call the cops because they know they have a gun. The average response time for police is 5 to 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of dead people by the time the cops get there.
That's right.
So the other answer to that is you try to make it where you remedy this situation in getting a gun there quicker. And the best way to do that is to already have a gun there.
Absolutely.
Whether you have a hired guard or you have teachers who are are former law enforcement, like I am. I'm now a school teacher. You have former military, or you have people who simply are very good with guns. They get trained, and you have a strategy to place guns inside the school where only a few, maybe 4 or 5 teachers and administrators know where the guns are, and you announce to the public, we are no longer a gun-free zone. Anybody coming here is going to be confronted, and not just like Dr. Carson said, that let's all attack him and try to tackle him. Let's shoot him.
Yeah.
And you start putting that out there,
Yeah.
and I guarantee you're going to see fewer mass shootings.
Oh, absolutely. And as our friend Bobby Lago likes to say, when seconds count, police are minutes away. It is up to us. I have a friend on Twitter we had on the show recently. He's an amazing guy, and he makes great arguments for liberty and freedom. And he always says, he mostly focuses on economics, Sheriff Mack, but he always says, I don't argue on the basis of outcomes. Even though capitalism gives better outcomes, I argue on the morality of free markets. And you kind of do that as well. You said statistical analysis is secondary because, we have a right to defend ourselves. And whenever we need it, we're calling somebody with a gun, and 5 or 10 minutes is a long time to be a sitting duck.
Yeah, it's way too long, and I don't like it. I don't like the thought of, my children are going to wait in that school for 10 minutes before somebody with a gun comes to protect them.
God.
That's crazy.
That's
no, that's just crazy.
And your colleague, David Clark, the sheriff out of Milwaukee, he had that great PSA where he called on citizens to be partners. Can I count on you? You can either sit there or you can fight back. And, there's a friend of mine who's a talk show host in Tallahassee, Will Dance, the pirate hunter. He's running for sheriff in Wakulla County. And he told me on the phone just recently, he said, if I win, I will take 100 people or so in the community, and I will tell them, be ready to be deputized if need be. If there's an emergency, I'm going to call on I'm going to deputize trusted members of the community, and you're going to help us keep this place safe, and if need be, repel federal or international forces. Do you think that's a good idea?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We really support the sheriffs in this country who have formed posses, and they should. And it's lawful, and it's within their power, and they should do it. We all should be part of that. That's how our country was founded, because we had Minutemen and militias and posses formed where the people were involved. And we bestow all power in this country. Whether politicians like to admit that and face that fact or not, we the people is the first 3 words of the Constitution. We bestow all power. The politicians need our permission to act. They need our permission to exist. We don't need theirs. This is our country. It's our government. And it's our Constitution.
Sheriff Richard Mack.
And tell him to, if he needs my endorsement, give me a call.
Oh, I absolutely will have him do it. He'll be thrilled to hear that. There's another interesting side story going on with him right now that I'll tell you about later. But I wanted to ask you to explain this to people. How do you explain when people say, "Wait a minute, Sheriff, the federal government, the supremacy clause says the federal government's the boss." They're not reading the supremacy clause, right, are they?
No, they're not. And not only that, but the supremacy clause was written in the original Constitution. The Bill of Rights was added 2 years later, where the Founding Fathers, especially Patrick Henry, said, no, this doesn't quite go far enough. We need a Declaration of Rights, and we need to make sure that there's a list of untouchables where government can never violate these certain rights. So they listed them, and they actually started with 189, and they dwindled them down to 12, and the states, the real power in this country, the states ratified 10. There was no federal government at that time. There was a continental Congress, but there was no real country. We were not a country until the Constitution was formulated, and at that time they formed a federal government that was to remain impotent. In fact, again, Scalia in my decision says the federal government was only delegated, and that's the word in the 10th Amendment the founders used. The federal government was delegated certain powers, and anything else was retained by the states. So you have that problem. the Founding Fathers never saw there was a contradiction with the Supremacy Clause and the 10th Amendment. Both require the federal government to be checked and balanced by state authority and other federal agencies, by the three separation of powers. And more importantly, the Supremacy Clause says that the laws of the nation that are made pursuant to the Constitution become supreme. So there's been no supremacy in Washington, D.C. for decades because they haven't followed the Constitution in decades. So, no, the whole thing about supremacy requires constitutional adherence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
in other words, if they
and so that the only supremacy comes if they follow the Constitution.
Yeah, if they, and not only that, Sheriff Mack, you and I try to explain that if they pass a bill that is that's not in the Constitution, if they try to assume a power or a jurisdiction of, say, education, for example, and if it's not in the Constitution, it's not the law of the land, and certainly if it's repugnant to or contradictory to the Constitution, like any gun control law, then that certainly is invalid and null, isn't it?
Right, it is, and we have 20,000 such pretend laws in the country. And I will say this. The Founding Fathers intended, if you read the Second Amendment, you read what the founders, Richard Henry Lee, Jefferson, Washington, all the main founders or some of the others that aren't so famous, you read what they said and read the intent of the founders in penning the Constitution in the first place and the Second Amendment, you will absolutely come face to face with the inescapable conclusion that gun control is against the law and was intended to be against the law in this country, and that law-abiding citizens are never to be barred the use of firearms. And that was from Patrick Henry and Jefferson right there, paraphrasing a little bit of what they said. But they were very strong on this. In fact, Richard Henry Lee said, to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms. So how are we thinking that we're protecting liberty today when we have over 20,000 gun control laws, all of which unconstitutional? Nothing that Hillary Clinton has said or proposed, nothing that Obama has proposed regarding gun control is aimed at taking guns away from criminals. It's all aimed at you and me.
That's a really good point, Sheriff Richard Mack. You are one of my very, very favorite patriots in America. You not only as a sheriff, but you stood up against the Clinton administration and defeated them in the Supreme Court, which sort of reestablished or reminded us of the anti-commandeering doctrine. But, you do such a good job, Sheriff Mack, of explaining the supreme law of the land, not an antiquated, remarkable document, the supreme law of the land, the one that made the president, made the Congress, made the Supreme Court, and listed the powers that we gave it. And one of the things that I wish Americans would understand is that we don't have a national government, do we? We have a federal government, and that's different than a national government.
Yeah, in fact, they were really worried about them getting too national, and they don't have national jurisdiction. When the FBI was formed in 1935, who was the head law enforcement authority in the states or the counties at that time? Well, we all know the states were, and the counties, and that the county sheriff was the ultimate authority in his county, just as history has pointed out. If you look back when 1650, when the first sheriff was formed in Delaware and some of the other original colonies, and then when the 13 original states had their sheriffs, the sheriffs were all in authority then. So in 1935, did the sheriffs concede or cede over to the federal government their authority? Was there a contract? Was there a new deal? That never happened, and the power has just been gradually usurped, and it's been a Fabianistic attempt to steal authority from the states and the counties by the federal government. And if we're going to get that back, as Scalia also says in my decision, a healthy balance of power between the states and the federal government, if we're going to get that back, the counties and states have got to get to work. And this whole solution is peaceful and effective, and that is the sheriff stand up and say, hey, there's a few things you're not going to do in my county anymore. And right now, one of the greatest sheriffs in America Sheriff Hanlon in Douglas County, Oregon, is being attacked because he has been associated with our national group, the CSPOA, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. We're proud to be associated with Sheriff Hanlon. We're proud to have him on board with us, and he already signed a letter a couple of years ago that we have on our website of about 450 sheriffs that did it, telling the federal government, don't try any of your more of your gun control in my county because we're not going to tolerate it. So this thing has been moving, and Burnie, you know our CSPOA has been burning the streets of America, and we just ask everybody go there, become a member, and go to cspoa.org. And Burnie, I really thank you for the time today and the good people that you have on your listenership too.
Sheriff Mack, thank you so much for being with us. I tell you, I get worried because what used to be snowballs of encroachment is now an avalanche of not only state, federal, but international encroachment. And finally, you wrote a book called Are You a David? And it's a book I want everybody to get, and I want everybody to read. Will you tell us what your point of that book was before you leave us?
Well, the point of the book is plain and simply: do you have the courage to stand against David? Against Goliath, and do you consider yourself humble enough and knowledgeable enough to stand as David did against Goliath? Now, you don't need to kill anybody, and I'll reiterate that part, but plain and simply, put yourself in the way so that the people of your county and community are protected from the real criminals of America, and that's the Goliath in Washington, D.C. We've got to be stronger. We've got to stand against the crimes of the Washington, D.C. establishment. And specifically, I bring up in the book, the IRS. How are we going to protect the Americans, law-abiding Americans, who get ruthlessly attacked by the IRS? We know the IRS has committed crimes in this country and been political hitmen for presidents for 50, 60, 70 years. Yeah. FDR did it too. So how are we really going to protect them? And that means you must have a David sheriff. You must have a constitutional sheriff. You must have somebody with the courage to just stand in the way and say, hey, you're not going to conduct random audits on the people in my county anymore. The random audits are unconstitutional. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court does not run my office. They do not run this county. If Lena Kagan wants to run against me, tell her to come out here and do it. But I am running this according to the dictates of my conscience and the constitutional oath that I took, and we will not allow any more of the abuses and tyranny from the IRS or any other federal agency. That's what the book is about.
That's amazing. Sheriff Richard Mack, you are a great, great friend of the show, and we're grateful to have you. Thanks for being with us today.
Hey, thank you. We'll talk to you soon, Burnie. Thanks much.
All righty. And again, that is Sheriff Richard Mack. You can find, if you want to find out more about him, go online, and it's the CSPOA is the name of the organization. It stands for Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And what he reminds us of across the country with this organization is that in a state, in a country, in a county, the most powerful person in that county when it comes to law enforcement is the sheriff. He is the only constitutional constable. He outranks the federal government. And it was shown to be true. Thank goodness. The Supreme Court upheld that in 1997 in that case. And again, it's Printz versus the United States, if you want to read it. Printz, Printz v. United States, if you want to read that case where Sheriff Richard Mack defeated the Clinton administration when they wanted his county to enforce the Brady Bill. And he said, go take a flying leap, essentially, is what he said. And now there are other sheriffs, and some states are even, not by state, by the way, not Florida. Florida's not doing it, but some states are doing it in their legislatures, and they are voting to not enforce and not use their resources to enforce federal acts that are draining them and federal acts that are unconstitutional. It's something that you probably only really hear on this show. I don't know if many other talk about. Have you ever heard it anywhere else? The anti-commandeering doctrine. It is not some wacko bird theory. It is constitutional. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court. But I got to tell you, and Sheriff Richard Mack just made a comment about it. You know, the Supreme Court, let's remember, is not supposed to rule over the rest of the people in the United States. I mean, how much sense does it make if the states would the states create a federal government that could rule over the states? Do you think the states would have ever done that? The states didn't do that. As a matter of fact, the relationship works this way. This is really important to understand. And I learned this from Chris Ann Hall recently. The Constitution is a contract not between the states and the federal government, like I used to think. It's a contract between the states themselves. And the product of that contract and agreement is the federal government. And the federal government was there to sort of referee that the states did not create tariffs against each other, that they could have free and regular commerce, that the federal government would deal with other nations and so on and so forth. But never, ever that the federal government would subjugate the states and rule over the states. And when you take a look at the three branches of the federal government, it's known as judicial review. Judicial review, and it was early on in the 1800s, where the Supreme Court assumed the power to be the final arbiter of whether something is constitutional or not. Now, how does that make any sense at all? How can one branch of the federal government rule over, how can 9 people, 5 really, rule over the rest of the free citizens of the United States? It is absurd on its face. And it's wrong. And that's why I think we need to get back to real education. I mean, our kids are growing up and graduating without knowing the first thing about civics, history, or economics. And so now we have, 40 years or so? How long of the Federal Department of Education? And it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, and that is get kids out of school without knowing. Why would the federal government teach kids principles that are not in the best interest of the federal government? That's why any people who give their kids to the federal government and don't sort of help out their education, fill in the blanks of the important stuff, is guaranteed not to be a free country for very long. And Thomas Jefferson made that point. You know the quote that basically says a society that thinks it can be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. So yeah, we're all for education, but I'm not for government indoctrination that some people call public schools. That's a lot, huh? Well, I am so grateful that we had a chance to have Sheriff Richard Mack on the show today. Again, if you're curious about his book, it's called Are You a David? And he's very good, isn't he? He's very succinct and very cogent, and he's able to articulate the principles of our constitutional republic in a way that's easy to understand. He's just a tremendous guy, and really, really grateful to know him. And again, if you want to look up the anti-commandeering doctrine, print it out, know what it means. It's basically the principle where states say, we're not going to fight you, right? We're not going to resist you, but we're also not going to assist you. That's important. We're not going to resist you, but we're not going to assist you either. So if you want to come and enforce your fishing regulations, by the way, then you're going to have to send your federal agents here to do it. We're not doing it. Now, some governors and sheriffs would say we should go farther than that. And we should say, don't even try to send your federal agents because we will block you. You're not going to come and shake down and harass the citizens of this state. That's what we got to get back to, or else there's going to be 2 options. We're either going to be subjects who must comply with a national government at every turn, or there's going to be either a peaceful revolt or we're going to be in that situation, or it's going to be ugly. Would you agree with that? I hope that you'll follow us on Twitter at Burnie Thompson, on Facebook, The Burnie Thompson Show, and on YouTube. You can always rewatch the shows on YouTube if you'll just go to My Freedom Radio. That's the channel on YouTube. And I hope you'll subscribe while you're there as well. All right, that's going to wrap it up for us. I'm Burnie Thompson. Thanks for being with us, and I will see you tomorrow.